Self-Made Men by Stephen Leacock. They were both what we commonly call successful businessmen, men with well-fed faces, heavy signet rings on fingers like sausages, and broad, comfortable waistcoats, a yard and a half round the equator. They were seated opposite each other at the table of a first-class restaurant, and had fallen into conversation while waiting to give their order to the waiter. Their talk had drifted back to their early days, and how each had made his start in life when he first struck New York. "I tell you what, Jones," one of them was saying, "I shall never forget my first few years in this town. By George, it was pretty uphill work. Do you know, sir, when I first struck this place, I hadn't more than 15 cents to my name, hadn't a rag except what I stood up in, and all the place I had to sleep in, well, you wouldn't believe it, but it's a gospel fact just the same. It was an empty tar barrel. No, sir," he went on, leaning back and closing up his eyes in an expression of infinite experience. "No, sir, a fellow accustomed to luxury like you has simply no idea what sleeping out in a tar barrel and all that kind of thing is like." "My dear Robinson," the other man rejoined briskly, if I've had no experience of hardship of that sort, you never made a bigger mistake in your life. Why, when I first walked into this town, I hadn't a cent, sir, not a cent. As for lodging, all the place I had for months and months was an old piano box up a lane, behind a factory. Talk about hardship, I guess I had it pretty rough. You take a fellow that's used to a good warm tar barrel and put him into a piano box for a night or two, and you'll see mighty soon." "My dear fellow," Robinson broke in with some irritation, "you merely show that you don't know what a tar barrel's like. Why, on winter nights when you're shut up in there, in your piano box, just as snug as you please, I used to lie awake shivering with a draught fairly running in the bunghole and at the back." "Draught!" sneered the other man, with a provoking laugh. "Draught! Don't talk to me about draughts. This box I speak of had a whole darn plank off it, right on the north side, too. I used to sit there studying in the evenings, and the snow would blow in at foot deep. And yet, sir," he continued more quietly, "though I know you'd not believe it, I don't mind admitting that some of the happiest days of my life were spent in that same box. Ah, those were the good old times, bright, innocent days, I can tell you. I'd wake up there in the morning and fairly shout with high spirits. Of course, you may not be able to stand that kind of life." "Not stand it!" cried Robinson fiercely. "Me not stand it! By God, I'm made for it. I just wish I had a taste of the old life again for a while. As for innocence, well, I bet you weren't as 1/10 as innocent as I was. No, nor 1/5, nor 1/3. What a grand old life it was. You'd swear this is a darned lie and refuse to believe it. But I can remember evenings when I'd have 2 or 3 fellows in, and we'd sit round and play Pedro by the candle half the night." "2 or 3?" laughed Jones. "Why, my dear fellow, I've known a half dozen of us to sit down to supper in my piano box and have a grand game of Pedro afterwards. Yes, and charades and forfeits, and every other darn thing. Mighty good suppers they were, too. By Jove, Robinson, you fellows round this town have ruined your digestion with high living, have no notion of the zest with which a man can sit down to a few potato peelings, or a bit of broken pie crust, or—" "Talk about hard food," interrupted the other. "I guess I know all about that. Many's the time I breakfast off a little cold porridge that somebody was going to throw away from a back door, or I've gone round to a livery stable and begged a little bran mash that it intended for the pigs. I'd venture to say I've eaten more hog food—" "Hog food!" shouted Robinson, striking his fist savagely on the table. "I tell you, hog food suits me better than—" He stopped speaking with a sudden grunt, surprised as the waiter appeared with the question. "May I bring you— what may I bring you for dinner, gentlemen?" "Dinner?" said Jones, after a moment of silence. "Dinner? Oh, anything, nothing. I never care what I eat. Give me a little cold porridge if you've got it, or a chunk of salt pork, anything like that. It's all the same to me." The waiter turned with an impassive face to Robinson. "You can bring me some of that cold porridge too," he said, with a defiant look at Jones. "Yesterday's, if you have it, and a few potato peelings, and then a glass of skim milk." There was a pause. Jones sat back in his chair and looked hard across at Robinson. For some moments the two men gazed into each other's eyes with a stern, defiant intensity. Then Robinson turned slowly round in his seat and beckoned to the waiter, who was moving off with a muttered order on his lips. "Here, waiter," he said with a savage scowl, "I guess I'll change that order a little. Instead of that cold porridge, I'll take, yes, a little hot partridge. And you may as well bring me an oyster or two on the half shell, and a mouthful of soup, mock turtle, consomme, anything. And perhaps you might fetch along a dab of fish and a little peck of Stilton, and a grape or a walnut. The waiter turned to Jones. I guess I'll take the same, he said simply, and added, and if you might bring a quarter of champagne at the same time. And nowadays, when Jones and Robson meet, the memory of the tar barrel and the piano box is buried as far out of sight as a home for the blind under a lampshade. That is Stephen Leacock with Slf Md Mn, which I have a feeling that the fellows of Monty Python have heard, either read this or variations of this. I mean, it's probably just the old story of you get two old timers competing to see who had the hardest life. We walked home from school uphill both ways in the winter, a night at 50 below. You know, that kind of thing. Yeah. The timeless classics. Did it start here, or was Stephen Leacock simply improving on somebody else? I do not know. More videos later.